I really appreciate being here. Thank you for having me. And first, I want to ask if you have had either a professional or personal connection to childhood cancer, would you please raise your hand? Wow. Okay. I like to say it's a lot like fundraising. Nobody gets into this on purpose. It's a very difficult thing. I certainly didn't, and I'm going to tell you my very brief story. Like most people in fundraising back in my day, I got involved because I was at an agency that lost its federal grant, lost its funding, and if I didn't raise money, no one else would, and we would go under. So I was very fortunate to be trained by some of the best in nonprofit management and fundraising of all kinds. And for many years, every position I had was from one of those trainers calling me and saying, I really want you to go interview somewhere. So one day I was minding my own business and got one of those calls, and this woman who I had tremendous respect for said, you know that John Wayne died of cancer a few years ago, and his family has teamed up with a doctor. Oops. His family has teamed up with a doctor at UCLA. Some people think he's crazy, but he thinks that we might be able to train the immune system to fight cancer. And he's had a little success already in melanoma. And I said, you know, Flo, I really appreciate it, but I love the Natural History Museum. I come to work every day and there are dinosaurs and gems and minerals, and I get to see kids playing with beetles, and I really love it here, so thank you very much. She said, well, I want you to think about it for a week and I'm going to call you back. I said, okay. So what happened during that week is the ornithology curator, who was very beloved by all of us, he'd been losing weight, and we thought, you know, wow, Ralph, you're looking good. What we didn't know is that Ralph didn't know why he was losing weight, and neither did his doctor. Remember, this is in the 80s. So that week, we found out that Ralph had been diagnosed with colon cancer, and essentially it was too late. And we were going to be saying goodbye to Ralph. The bird hall at the Natural History Museum is now named for him. So when Flo called back a few days later, I told her the story, and she said, well, they're also working on research to diagnose people earlier. I said, okay, I'm in. So I went and I interviewed, and that's how I got into cancer research. I have to tell you, science is the only thing I was not good at school. I knew nothing about research. I didn't know anything about, I didn't know what metastasis meant. I knew nothing. Several positions later, I decided I'd had enough of the politics in nonprofits, because there's politics everywhere. And I was going to be a consultant, and I had my business cards and my letterhead. I was even working on a website. And somebody showed me this ad for the director of development at the National Childhood Cancer Foundation. And I think I cursed, actually, because I knew that's where I needed to go. I showed the ad to my husband, and he said, yeah, that's where you need to go. So that letterhead is scrap paper now. And I went there as director of development, and that morphed into the St. Baldrick's Foundation. And when we founded the St. Baldrick's Foundation, we knew how to raise money. We had raised a lot of money. We didn't know how to give it away. And that became my privilege to figure out with the doctors that we work with, the researchers, very kind people like TJ at the American Cancer Society, who I could always call and say, what do you do when this happens? So it's been my privilege to become a chief mission officer, so no, maybe I won't ask for your checkbooks today. Today, what we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about St. Baldrick's, talk about childhood cancer, the outcomes that we're going for, how we get there, and what our goals are for the future. So with any nonprofit, our mission statement, we are a volunteer and donor-powered charity committed to supporting the most promising research to find cures for childhood cancers and give survivors long and healthy lives. Why do we shave heads? We do shave heads in solidarity with children with cancer. But the main reason we shave heads is to raise money. We often talk about the importance of raising awareness, but the only reason it's important for people to be aware is so that we can raise more money, so that we can do more research, so that we can cure more kids. So let's get this out of the way. Everybody always wants to know, how did this crazy thing happen? If you don't know yet, we are those crazy head shaving people. So first, who started it? Two men from Ireland, one proud Irish American from Long Island, were at a 4th of July party. And one of them challenged his younger two friends to find a way to give back because they had done so well in their business at such an early age. And he said, "You're not leaving tonight until you come up with something." One of them had this crazy head of hair. I mean, it was flock of birds, crazy hair. And John said, "I bet people would pay a lot of money to see you shave your head." And Inda said, "I will if you will." Well, the reinsurance industry has a huge St. Patrick's Day party every year in Lower Manhattan, Jim Brady's pub. And they said, let's turn the St. Patrick's Day party into a St. Baldrick's party. We'll get a bunch of people to shave their heads and raise money. We'll make it for childhood cancer research because they knew kids when they were young that had been lost. And they called my boss at the National Childhood Cancer Foundation and said, "We're going to do this crazy thing. We're going to shave heads in a pub. Will you take our money?" And my boss said, "Hell yeah." So that's their idea has turned into what is now the largest funder of childhood cancer research grants in the world other than the US government. Margaret Mead's quote is one of my favorite. "Never let it be said that a few caring people can't change the world, for indeed that's all who ever have." So we're going to go through some history really quickly here. That first event, by the way, was St. Patrick's Day in 2000. They did expect 17 people to raise $1,000 each. And by the end of the night, they were walking out with $104,000, mostly in cash, in a white tablecloth. And when they showed up at the pub, they all looked at each other and said, "Who brought the razors?" And somebody went down to the drugstore. So I just want you to know, like, from the very most humble of beginnings, we have come. In 2001, a woman named Kathleen Ruddy was hired to be the major gifts director at the National Childhood Cancer Foundation. And on her first day of work, our boss said to her, "These reinsurance guys have a lot of money. They have a lot of friends with a lot of money. Why don't you see what you can do with this event?" So she asked that we'd already determined that they'd like us to help spread this beyond reinsurance. And she started working with them. Things were going really well for planning for 2002. And as you all know, September 11th, 2001, the towers came down. Two of our founders worked in Lower Manhattan and watched it happen. And they didn't surface for a while, other than to let us know they were okay. We didn't know what was going to happen. But they came back in October, and they said, "Children are still dying with cancer. We're still raising money. We're on." So that first year, beyond just the founders, we had 37 events across the country. We raised $1 million. And we knew that we were onto something. So fast forward, we grew like wildfire. I have never seen anything like it in my life. When we say volunteer-driven, I do mean volunteer-driven. It was all we could do to keep up. By late 2004, the founders had decided to start their own foundation. It was kind of outgrowing its host. And we came up with a memorandum of understanding, and this, I guess, would be our first strategic partnership. NCCF existed to fund the work of something called the Children's Oncology Group, which is a cooperative research group, 220 institutions all across the country. And so we said, for the first 3 years of this new foundation, our primary beneficiary will still be the COG. It's fine, it's what we were raising money for all along, no problem. But in 2005, when it came time to make the very first grants as a new foundation, we're all set because we know, the COG gets most of the money. But one of the docs that our founders had met had said, there's a real fear that there's going to be a shortage of pediatric cancer researchers if we don't start priming the pump, if we don't start getting new people into this field. It's not the most lucrative field of medicine that you can go into. So we funded our first fellow, St. Baldrick's Fellow, and that was the beginning of a good tradition that we have of funding the next generation. The only thing I'll point out on this slide is that in 2010, we had our first Research Priorities Summit. We got 20 people in a room, 20 childhood cancer experts from around the country, and we're very cheap, so it was a basement room in a hotel in New York. And we basically said, what are we doing that we shouldn't do, and what are we not doing that we should do? And that was the whole of the agenda, which was kind of fun. And we came up with a couple of new funding categories. One is they said, it's great that you're funding training for the next generation, but you need to start earlier. So we now have college students and med school students who have summer fellowships and try and dip their toe into the water and get them engaged early on. We also had a PhD nurse there. And she said, it's great that you're doing research for cures, but you also need to do research on supportive care, symptom management and quality of life issues. And so we started doing that. 2015, we certainly can't claim all the credit for this, but that was the year that the third drug in the last 20 years was approved specifically for a childhood cancer, and we did support some of that research. 2014, I'm still trying to get back to the $27.2 million we granted that year. Been a little flat since then. But today, we're still those crazy head shaving people, but I think our secret sauce has always been that we're a fun way to fight a serious problem. It's a problem that early on in my career I'd start talking about my work and you could literally see people itching to leave. They didn't want to talk about childhood cancer, it's too scary. But we make it fun. It's kind of hard not to laugh if somebody says, how much would you donate to see me shave my head? It's really hard not to have fun at a St. Baldrick's event. Who is the St. Baldrick's Foundation? There's no saint. We get asked that all the time. Just a whole bunch of really passionate people working to cure childhood cancer. Speaking of people, every year we have 5 ambassadors, and we have more than 5,500 now families of honored kids that our shavies and events and teams can shave in honor of. But we have 5 ambassadors every year, and they represent kids everywhere, and we tell their stories pretty intensely during that year. And one of them is always deceased to represent the fact that 1 in 5 in the US today will die. So I'm going to tell you this year's ambassadors quickly. Ariana is 4 years old. She has a very rare type of leukemia. She's still in treatment, and she loves one of my favorite things, going to the library. Aiden is the one this year who represents those who have passed away. He had DIPG, which, to my knowledge, no one has ever survived. He lived in Alabama. Sullivan is 12. He has medulloblastoma, which is a type of brain tumor, and he's what every cancer patient wants to be. He's Ned. He's no evidence of disease, and his dad is his superhero. Gabby lives in Southern California. She was in a wheelchair when I met her. Don't think she is anymore. She's a typical California girl, loves swimming and the beach and her dogs and Disneyland. We're going in age order, if you haven't noticed. Brooke is in Northern California. She's 23. She's in pre-med at Stanford. In fact, she's working in the lab of one of the researchers that we fund. She has AML, which is the more difficult type of leukemia, and she's in remission, although she's fighting GVHD, graft versus host disease. We are a US-based organization, and pretty much we fund US research. However, when we raise money in other countries, we find a partner in that country to take all of the money raised minus our expenses. And it's been kind of funny calling some people in some countries to try and explain this and telling them that we're shaving heads and we're looking for them to take our money. It's kind of hard for people to believe sometimes. I also mentioned the Children's Oncology Group, and they have members in other countries as well. And we fund some people from low-income and middle-income countries to come to the US to be trained with a commitment to continue their research at their home institution. And there's one other award that we grant annually, and we'll talk about that later, that's in another country. This map would have more than 300 dots if it had a dot for every place that we make grants, but you'll notice first that Atlanta is on the list and gets quite a few grants from us, actually. One of the things that we focus on is making sure that we're funding in areas where we're raising money, even if those are smaller areas like Boise, Idaho, Albuquerque. And the way we did this early on is we decided with our expert advice, that everybody needs infrastructure support. And we want more clinical trials to be available for kids no matter where they are, so that they don't have to uproot their whole family and move to Memphis, Tennessee, or Atlanta, or LA. And so we make infrastructure grants mostly to fund the staff that make more clinical trials possible at those institutions. So yes, we are here to change the reality for children with cancer. We don't choose institutions to fund or researchers to fund. We take research applications, as TJ taught us actually, and as we learned from others, the best way to fund research is to take applications, no matter where they're from. You do the scientific review and you fund the best of them. If that best happens to be in Albuquerque, that's what you fund. So how big is the problem, childhood cancer? To some degree, it depends on where in the world you are. In Africa, there are about 100,000 or more children diagnosed per year, and only about 10% of them will survive. But let's focus on the US and most developed countries. More children die of cancer than AIDS, asthma, diabetes, cystic fibrosis, and congenital anomalies combined. And I remember when I was first at the John Wayne Cancer Institute asking my boss, do kids get cancer? And she said, well, not really. And I said, well, they do or they don't. She said, well, it's just so rare and there's hardly any research going on. Well, 1 in 285 kids before they turn 20 in the US will get cancer. That's not nobody. So progress didn't really start until the 1950s and 60s. If you haven't already read or seen The Emperor of All Maladies, I would highly encourage that. It's a great history of cancer research, and it shows some of the ways that childhood cancer research sort of led the way. Chemotherapy was first used in children. The stat that more than 90% of kids with the most common type of cancer will live leukemia skews all the stats. Because there are more kids who have leukemia, there's been more research, and more of those kids do survive. However, there are many cancers for which there is no cure. Brain tumors are among them. You never hear anybody say, I have adult cancer. You have lung cancer, or colon cancer, or breast cancer, melanoma. Same thing for kids. There are many kinds of childhood cancers. 12 major types, hundreds of subtypes. Babies can be born with cancer, and there are cancers that strike both kids and adults, but we're learning more and more about subtypes and about how different some of those diseases are. Some research that we supported recently showed just how different pediatric AML, acute myeloid leukemia, is from the AML that 65-year-olds get. And the research for one doesn't necessarily impact the other. As Kermit would say, it's not easy being rare. So yes, it is the biggest disease killer of children. However, that's still only about 15,000 cases per year in the US. By definition, that is rare. And even within childhood cancer, there are so many types. I heard of a type last week. A friend of a friend had a child diagnosed with something I had never heard of in all these 22 years. It's a type of brain tumor. But when you take the patients with those rare childhood cancers and put them together, that's about 30% of the patients. So you see the challenge in doing research. And the number of kids diagnosed has been increasing steadily since 1975, and that is not believed to be just better diagnosis. That is believed to be an increased incidence. So this slide says it all, and you can imagine why there have been so many more drugs developed for adults. About 60% of the money for drug development in adults comes from the pharmaceutical industry. Pharmaceutical industry has to make a profit. There's not a lot of profit to be made on a drug that is going to affect maybe 50 kids diagnosed a year for a rare type of childhood cancer. Now, this number 3 has been developed specifically for pediatric cancers, does not reflect the fact that many of the drugs developed first for adults are later repurposed. The childhood cancer community would like that to be faster, and they would like some drugs of their own. So what's the outcome that we want? We don't want kids just to survive. We want them to live a long and healthy life, and someday prevent the whole thing. But we need new cures. Right now, if you have one of the most common types of cancer, yes, your odds are good, unless you relapse. Then it gets very bad. There's still no cure for some, and while the treatments are saving lives, they're leaving survivors with devastating health effects. The most serious of these are heart problems and secondary cancers. Not to say the others aren't serious and that there aren't a lot more of these. A study that we supported out of St. Jude last year came out with this alarming stat at the bottom that by the age of 50, 96% of survivors of childhood cancer have experienced a life-threatening health event as a result of their treatment. That's 96%. 99% have experienced some late effect of their treatment. So here's what we're going for, and this is my favorite slide of the deck. This family lives about an hour from here, and there's a story here. Carlos and Tina Sandy, their second daughter, Althea, was diagnosed with AML when she was an infant and died at the age of 2. A few years later, Phineas was born, and when Phineas was 4, he was diagnosed with a different kind of leukemia, ALL. And that's supposed to be the easy kind. But Phineas couldn't get into remission. Nothing was working. And they had run out of options. There was nothing left until they found a clinical trial that was being conducted at the NCI. It was done as part of the Pediatric Cancer Dream Team, supported by St. Baldrick's together with the Stand Up to Cancer. And in this trial, they took some of Phineas's cells. They genetically reprogrammed them to fight cancer. And they gave him an injection. That was it. Not chemo, surgery, radiation, all that stuff. He got an injection. And he got pretty sick, like the flu, from the injection. But a couple weeks later, they tested, and Phineas has no cancer left in his body. Phineas was number 10 in this clinical trial, but he was the first in the trial that had never gotten into remission. The others had gotten into remission, and this was to see if they could keep them there. Phineas would have died. So this is Phineas checking the heart rate of his doctor, Trey Lee. And today, Phineas's parents report that his only real problem is math. He hates math. This is a very important little girl. Her name is Emily Whitehead, and she is the first patient treated with a CAR T-cell therapy, which I just described, who lived. And her doctor is at CHOP. He's one of the Dream Team members, and they are now working on this therapy for solid tumors. We have funded another 4-year grant for the Dream Team because they had such success the first time. And they're working on things like DIPG that kids don't survive today. This is one of my favorite stories. These are 2 former St. Baldrick's ambassadors. Sarah, the bride. Sarah had a rare combination of ALL and AML, 2 kinds of leukemia, and she fought really hard, and she survived. Abby, on the right, Abby had a rare type of ALL called Philadelphia positive chromosome. She was diagnosed at 4, and she had a really rough go of it. She's relapsed a number of times. And one day, and we were very involved with her family, and one day we got word that the doctors had said there isn't anything left we can do. Her organs were shutting down, not due to the cancer, but due to the treatment she had had to endure for so many years. So the family called us, and our director of family relations called me, and she said, you know how every year we have an ambassador who's deceased? Well, Abby's dying, and I want Abby to be the ambassador next year, but I want Abby to know that. I want to ask Abby herself if she will be our ambassador for next year. And we don't have to say she'll be the deceased ambassador, but I want to ask Abby and let her have that pleasure. And I said, okay. And we literally expected that any day Abby would pass away. Abby surprised everybody. First of all, she was thrilled to be an ambassador. But Abby is still alive, and this has been 2.5 to 3 years. She's a little chef in the making. She's had her own little TV show about cooking. But Abby and Sarah met at a camp, and when Sarah got married, Abby was her flower girl. So obviously those are the human side of the equation of what we want to see in outcomes. You can read these for yourself, but the first one here, ALL Ph positive, is the type of cancer that Abby had. And so more kids are surviving. We're making progress like this all the time. I wouldn't say all the time. These are some pretty dramatic jumps. But as you know, most research is incremental advances. These are two other things I wanted to highlight. Kymriah is the first gene therapy approved by the FDA in the US. It's also very rare in that it was approved first for kids. That's a therapy that saved Phineas. I can't say this very well, but Vitracvi is the first drug that was developed to target a key genetic driver rather than for a certain kind of cancer. Now, that driver only appears in a few cancers, but one of them is infantile fibrosarcoma, which typically strikes kids under the age of 1. We did not fund the research on Vitracvi itself, but we did fund several of the researchers who were involved who came back to report this to us and to thank us for having trained them early in their career to make it possible for them to be involved in such an advance. So it takes a lot of grants and a lot of research to do things like this and all the things that we still need to do. And we won't go through all 10 funding types, but basically we fund everything from new ideas in the laboratory to clinical trials and the infrastructure support that I mentioned to make more trials available to more kids in more places. In one of our research priority summits, these were identified as some of the focus areas that we should have. Adolescents and young adults, progress has lagged far behind children or older adults. Survivorship, we already touched on the dire need for research, not just to follow those survivors throughout their lives and make sure that they're getting the proper care, but also to reduce the treatment as far as we can so that we can still cure the child without causing those late effects to begin with. So I look at everything we fund in 3 big buckets, and they kind of overlap a little bit, but we'll go through them. Training the next generation, this is another favorite slide. We do fund fellowships. We fund summer fellows, I mentioned. Our scholar awards are what most people call young investigator awards, or early career development awards, rather. But we have this international scholar program, and I mentioned that they keep close ties with their home institution. Dr. Joseph Lubega is from Uganda, and he is finishing his training at Baylor. It was a 5-year program, and he and some of the people at Baylor were going back and forth during those 5 years. And Joseph Lubega actually started a training program in Uganda for pediatric oncology. And this August, the first 4 of those people graduated. So we talk about paying it forward, how one grant can have such a huge impact. But we have funded more than 100 fellows and scholars over the years, and about 3 to 5 international scholars each year. Discovery research is kind of everything else that's not training the next generation, except for what I call revolutionary research. I would say the Dream Team is revolutionary, but this is our other program that we're very proud of. I was at a Health Research Alliance meeting, which my friend TJ from the American Cancer Society introduced me to as well. And we heard a speaker say that the field of research has changed so much that young people used to be able to have a more wide-ranging career and be more innovative. Now you have to focus on such a small piece of research or you're not going to have a career. So he said what foundations really should do is find very innovative people early in their career and don't ask for an application, don't ask for a hypothesis, just give them money and tell them they're free to use it however they want to innovate in research and see what happens. So I called, right after that conference, I called Bob Arsisi, who was the head of our scientific advisory committee at the time, and I told him the idea, and he said, I love it. Let's talk about it Sunday night. Wednesday, I believe it was, Bob was killed in a hit-and-run accident on his way to work. And so we had the board meeting, and some of his friends really rallied and said, let's do that in memory of Bob. That's what Bob would want. Bob was known for thinking outside the box. He was one of those that didn't know there was a box, and this would be a perfect thing. He also was known for the desire to support research internationally. So we fund one of these awards in the spring to a US or Canadian researcher, and one in the fall to a researcher from any other country in the world. The awards are $250,000 a year for 3 years, and you have to be nominated, and the selection committee just looks at your record of innovation and what scientific questions you think are important. And we've had some really remarkable results. One paper came out from, our first international recipient was from England, and he said literally no one would have funded this. It was an outright crazy idea. No one would have funded it, but because I had this money, I was able to do it. We do have an advocacy program, and I would encourage you all to sign up for Speak Up. As you know, kids can't vote, and we need more federal funding. We also need better regulations and policies from the government. Some of our impact, we helped author the Childhood Cancer STAR Act, Survivorship, Treatment, Access, and Research. This was after listening to the childhood cancer community at large for quite a while, having lots of focus groups, finding out what's important to the community, and we authored this bill. The first year we didn't succeed, the second year we did, and that's kind of remarkable in this Congress. And it was the most comprehensive law ever enacted on behalf of kids with cancer. We don't have to go through all of the details of the STAR Act, but it's pretty phenomenal. Other advocacy impact, our advocacy program in particular collaborates with others. We have the Childhood Cancer Alliance that we co-chair, but we advocate not for more funding for any specific disease. Pitting diseases against each other in Congress doesn't go over very well, so we advocate for overall increases. These two bills are really important because one requires companies, when they're testing a drug in adults, to also test it in children. Otherwise, that doesn't happen for years, if ever. And the other is an incentive for drug companies to make drugs for smaller patient populations, which, as you know, includes all of childhood cancer, by giving them a priority FDA review for another drug that they think they can make a lot more money on. And this helps them to recoup their R&D cost. Kids with cancer obviously need us. And if anybody should have big, hairy, audacious goals, it's the St. Baldrick's Foundation. So some of our goals in research are to fund more of those innovation awards that I mentioned, because they are showing great progress. We're tackling with others the whole issue of data sharing. It's very complex. You can share your data, but if no one else can get to it and actually use it, what's the point? Gene therapies, immunotherapies, lots of other things coming down the pike. And then for revenue, we need more opportunities for people who don't want to shave their head. We do have a Do What You Want program, and the only limitation there is your own imagination and our insurance policy. We also are working with more major donors, so we decided that for a gift of $1 million or more, we will issue an RFA in the particular area of the donor's interest. And we did our first one last fall in osteosarcoma with a group of parents that formed the Osteosarcoma Collaborative. It was about $1.5 million over 3 years. We just got another $1 million donor for a Ewing sarcoma RFA, which is exciting. And then strategic partnerships. I mentioned the COG. We partner with them not only because we're their largest private funder, but also when they need us to go advocate for them on Capitol Hill if there's policy changing or funding issues or drug shortages. Stand Up to Cancer is another one. We've had lots of smaller partnerships. We co-fund a 5-year grant with the V Foundation, lots of other smaller foundations. And I'm really happy to announce that our newest partnership is with the American Cancer Society, which is headquartered right here in Atlanta. As I mentioned, the American Cancer Society has always been a group that we could call on when we needed help and advice. But TJ actually called me several months ago and said, we want to do more in childhood cancer, and we would like to partner with you. And I thought to myself, whew, because you could have competed with us. And it's been really remarkable. We're still in the formation stages, but we're going to raise money together and grant the money together. And it will be, TJ, how much is the total? $11 million. And we will issue RFAs. We're talking about funding correlative studies, which means if there's a clinical trial designed to answer one question, but you're collecting data and tissues that could answer other questions, but you don't have the money to do that, let's fund that. So, if you haven't been to a head shaving event yet, why not? What's keeping you? Atlanta is one of our first cities. That year that we had 37 events, or the first year, Atlanta was in the mix, and it's got a great tradition of supporting St. Baldrick's. And as I mentioned, if head shaving isn't your thing, we have lots of other volunteer opportunities. Join Speak Up to advocate for kids. It's really easy. It's on our website. And I told you my story in the beginning of how I got involved in childhood cancer. I never would have thought that that would be my career. My hope is that one of these days you'll be telling somebody else how you got involved in childhood cancer, because kids need all of us. Okay, thank you very much.